Jujutsu Kaisen chapter 269 just finished up, and Gojo did not come back. But on the bright side, Yuta is alive and inside of his own body. Now, there was a lot of talk in this chapter, so lock in, pay attention. So we open up with the chapter with Mei at a candy store talking to an old lady, and the first thing that she says is, "How much?" And right away, we immediately cut away from that, and we're back to Yuta and everybody else, and Yuta's fine. He is now back inside of his old body, but he still has the scars across his forehead because he still had to be transferred. Now, the reason he was able to actually be transferred and saved is due to Rika, but we're going to get into that in just a moment. Megumi, Yuji, and Nobita enter the scene, and they're wondering why they're all yelling at Yuta, with Megumi wanting to apologize for all of his action. But Maki and Kusakabe quickly interrupt him, saying that he has nothing to apologize for, it's not his fault. Megumi does explain that his head does still feel hazy, and he thinks it's due to the effects of the unlimited void, which of course would make sense. And then Kusakabe decides to open up his mouth and say that he has nothing to apologize for, this is all Gojo's fault. He says that none of this would have happened if Gojo didn't abstain from executing Itadori Yuji. And I understand where he's coming from, but is this really the time to be pointing fingers at Gojo of all people? And then he says that Yuji also has nothing to apologize for because he was just a pawn in Kenjaku's plan the entire time. He then explains that he used to be pro-execution of Yuji, but thanks to Yaga, he decided to help out. He says he doesn't think that either side was particularly wrong. They both had their own truths, and that's what led them to this current situation. But then he does say that the kids, Yuji, Nobita, and Megumi, shouldn't feel guilty at all. They're just kids, and all this responsibility does lie on the grown-ups, which is very mature of him. And then we move into the explanation as to how exactly Yuta was able to survive. Now, before people get upset, listen to the explanation because it does make sense and this has been shown before. Yuta explains that he thought that the connection between him and Rika was severed because Rika didn't follow him to Gojo's body. But actually, it turns out what was happening is that Rika was healing Yuta the entire 5 minutes that she was fully manifested. Remember that panel that we saw where Rika was holding and just clutching Yuta's body crying? That was her using reverse curse technique. And again, calm down because we've seen her do this. We saw her heal people in JJK0, so we know that this was a capability of Rika from the very start. Not only that, but Shoko had already healed up Yuta's body to the best of her ability earlier, so Rika was basically just finishing it all up. He explains that after his curse technique was burnt out from using the domain expansion, he was in a suspended state of animation. But after reconnecting with Rika one more time, he was able to be revived once more. To which Mei says this was simply a miscalculation because, like we all said from the very beginning, they gave possibilities of how Kenjaku's curse technique worked. They didn't actually know to the fullest extent. And then Maki comes in and explains that a lot of this was Yuta's fault because of lack of planning. And this is where I think that Akutami was listening to a lot of you guys complaining because he addressed a lot of different arguments that you guys were using. Maki says she should have been the one to actually do the surprise attack on Kenjaku. But Todo explains that they needed to catch him by surprise, which is why he needed to help him by swapping places. So yes, it is confirmed once again, Todo helped Yuta jump Kenjaku. But because Maki has no curse energy, he can't target Maki with Boogie Woogie. And like Yuta said from the very start, Rika was imperative in keeping all of the curse spirits that came from Geto's body handled while also unaliving Kenjaku at the same time. Next, Maki brings up that they should have used the recorder when Higuruma had the Executioner Sword to free Sukuna with Inumaki's cursed speech. And I made a video a long time ago defending this, saying that if Sukuna was stronger, the feedback and blowback onto Inumaki would have been too much. And in this chapter, they absolutely confirmed that that was the case. If Inumaki's recorder was played anywhere earlier in the battle, Sukuna would have been too powerful and Inumaki would have been unalived instantly. Oh, and by the way, Higuruma's alive. And Higuruma explains that the entire time Sukuna was toying with him because he thought he had the time. But if Yuta was there, Sukuna would have unalived Higuruma on the spot. So the main reason that he survived is because Yuta wasn't there and was instead taking care of Kenjaku. So basically, Maki has been the readers who think they found plot holes in Akutami's writing, and Todo, Higuruma, and Kusakabe are shutting it all down. But then she does acknowledge the help from Miguel and LaRue was imperative for them. But then she gets mad at Yuta again, saying that Yuta said they weren't coming, and Yuta genuinely thought they weren't going to. Apparently they showed up even though they said that they weren't going to. And then Yuji comes to the rescue, even further defending Yuta, saying that those cursed tools that he had that hit his fingers, those came from Yuta as well. And then one last point of defense, Yuta is even explained that his second domain stopped Sukuna from opening up his domain, and his first domain heavily weakened Sukuna with Jacob's Ladder. So basically, Yuta was kind of the GOAT and the MVP of the entire battle. Maki's about to say something else, but then she stops. I'm really assuming a lot of this projection of anger is just because she was worried about Yuta, because at the end of the day, we all know that they are kind of a thing. And then Todo says he shares some of the blame because he couldn't actually save Choso and Yuji from Sukuna's domain. And he explains it wasn't just a range issue. It was because Sukuna had so much cursed energy at the epicenter of his domain that he couldn't properly target both Choso and Yuji. And then it was explained, like we all thought, that Miwa did use her simple domain in order to save Maki, and then we did teleport Ino away. But Yuji says if anyone had actually taken Choso, then he would have been unalived instead, so no one's to blame. It was just a bad situation. Hikari says he wanted to join the battle against Sukuna after he actually got done battling Urame, but they were stronger than he thought, so he wasn't able to join. And yes, he used the word they. And then out of nowhere, the broom girl, Momo, says, oh, I wish I could have done more, which she was literally useless the entire time, so I don't know why Akutami even drew her in. But the Mei says, don't worry, your broom was fun to ride. Now, this next portion is a lot of talking, but essentially what they're doing is explaining how they got around the binding vow of the simple domain and being able to teach it to people outside of the clan. Essentially, the long-winded explanation saying that the binding vow kept people from actually being able to teach it, and it was the head of the clan who determined who could be taught the simple domain or not. Well, through a long contrived explanation of how they kind of hide the heads of the clans, it turns out that Kusakabe is actually the current holder of the binding vow of who can and cannot be taught the simple domain. Which kind of makes sense since he's the one who is kind of the master of simple domains, and because he's the one who can determine who gets taught simple domains, he said it's okay for everyone to be taught the simple domain. And it turns out a big reason for that is Mei, which is revealed at the end of the chapter, that she unalived the previous head of the simple domain users so that Kusakabe could be the one to inherit the will of who passes on the simple domain. Which is kind of how the chapter ends, with Mei unaliving an old woman who I assume was the previous head of the simple domain clan. And that's basically the entire chapter, with Akutami basically debunking a ton of things that a lot of people said was writing or holes in his writing. Such as being able to use Inumaki's curse speech a lot earlier than they actually did it, when in reality, like I had mentioned, it would have unalived Inumaki instead. Going through and explaining how the simple domain was actually taught to other people, despite the fact that they already mentioned the binding vow much earlier in the series, and showing exactly how that happened. Getting Yuta back inside of his own body while still utilizing the fact that Rika is able to use RCT on other people, which he saw as far back as JJK0, and of course giving us a reason as to why he drew the panel in the first place of Rika holding Yuta's body, which was kind of left up in the air. Guess what? That's been settled now. So this chapter seemed to be a big wrap-up chapter of a lot of plot points and a lot of complaints that JJK fans had, or I say fans, because if they had proper comprehension, none of these issues would have kind of been there for them. Overall, it was a good chapter. I mean, they needed a lot of explanation. I don't mind that there's not going to be nonstop action, because there's not really going to be that anymore with Sukuna gone. But with the fact that Yuta's back into his original body, it still holds true that there is a possibility of Gojo coming back, though that is lessening more and more, especially with Higuruma being alive and Higuruma staying to have the same potential as Gojo. It's possible that Higuruma, if they need someone to balance the world with, a Gojo-like character, Higuruma could be that guy since he stayed to have the same potential as Gojo. But one of my longer recaps for a chapter, because there's a lot of talking. Let me know what you guys think. I personally like the chapter, but I always want to hear your opinions.